Welcome to Better HR in 10 Minutes, where we take a question that is important to human resources professionals and discuss it in 10 minutes or less from the perspectives of an employment lawyer. That's me, Sarah Glasser, and an EEO trainer.
Broad decline.
Hi, Rodney.
Hi, Sarah.
So before we start, I have to remind everyone that although I am an attorney, this is not legal advice. It's just me and Rodney hanging out. Um, so Rodney, there has been so much discussion recently about DEI, and we're seeing executive orders come out of the federal administration. We're seeing the EEOC talk about DEI. We're seeing all kinds of other agencies being tasked with investigating it. And the common thread throughout a lot of this is the term illegal DEI. And I'm not sure I've seen a definition anywhere, but I've kind of tried to parse together what I think it might entail. Um, and from my perspective, I think like I can think of some things that are like obviously illegal, and then some things that perhaps if implemented one way or another, could be illegal. So I wanted to, sorry in advance, but I wanted to pose the question to you: what is illegal DEI?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is just kind of what you addressed. There's a lot of confusion out there, and why is there a lot of confusion? Because nobody defines DEI, right? It's just like an acronym that everybody uses, and everybody thinks that everybody else understands their definition of it. But you can tell, especially on social media, when people start commenting on things, that they all have different definitions of what this is. Nobody specifically says, hey, what about this particular program, right? That would be helpful. It would be helpful that if people define things, that they would actually define them. And I think what you see a lot of in the executive orders and at the EOC is they're just not defining this. And so it sort of leaves this ambiguity, this gray area as to, well, we're not really sure what they're talking about. Nobody really says. I mean, I'm not a DEI trainer, but DEI covers a huge amount of ground. I'm sure there's a lot of DEI programs I've never heard of. But so when I say DEI, that's going to be different than it will for somebody else. So I think in a way, almost using the acronym is kind of counterproductive. I think we need to talk about individual programs. And I think if you were talking about things that are, and I think I'm probably hitting on where you were going, the things that are just obviously illegal are, well, quotas and preferences, right? You can't get more illegal than that. They've been illegal for 60 years is you
Yeah.
can't use a quota or a preference in making a hiring decision if that's based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, or disability.
Hmm.
How
Right.
about you, Sarah? Is that what you're is that kind of what you run into a lot when people start asking you these questions?
Well, honestly, I don't get a ton of questions on this,
Oh.
because I don't think anyone or none of my clients are out there with a quota or a preference. I mean, at least that they're telling me about. If you have that,
Isn't
and
that funny though? Because like when you watch the news, right, there are all these stories about how these big companies are like, let's say, dropping DEI, and the suggestion, if not actually said, is that they were using quotas and preferences. And I used to investigate discrimination for a living, so quite frankly, I think anything is possible, but I don't know how probable a lot of that is because these aren't not small mom and pops, right? These are large corporations and they all have general counsels and they all have a small army of employment law attorneys. And you would think that if some CEO or board member just kind of wandered in off the street one day and said, hey, I've got this great idea. Let's do quotas and preferences. That all those attorneys would just literally throw their bodies in front of that bus. So it's hard to say how much is really going on. I know that it's the issue that a lot of people are talking about. I don't know how prevalent it is. What about
I would,
you?
if I were to take a guess, I would probably think that it is something somewhere it's not quite so harsh as we have like a written policy, or we were sitting
Right.
around the board table one day and we said we need more women here. And so we're only gonna hire women. But it's probably more akin to something that happens perhaps a little more unconsciously, or is sort of seeping down in less of a like a policy type way and coming up more in practice. So people are in the process of hiring and they've got a diverse candidate and a non-diverse candidate, and they're otherwise equal, and they're saying, really love some diversity around here. Something like that. And like I'm shouldn't joke about it. I don't mean to joke about it, but that is what
No.
I would imagine is more the issue than someone top down saying we are going to
Right.
have a policy.
Yeah, and also because it's kind of ambiguously or not defined at all, I think that it lends itself to ex very logical questions. And that is, I get the fact that that's illegal, but how far do you extend this? In other words, if I have programs that might open up barriers or open up doors for certain groups of people, well, is that illegal as well? Because because nobody's really pointing to specific programs and saying, well, that's illegal or this isn't illegal. And I think that that ambiguity is causing a lot of confusion in the workplace. I think most of us understand that the quotas and preferences are wrong, but the big question is well, how far does that go?
I agree. If you've got a program that opens up opportunities for a particular set of people or a particular group, and you don't make that program available to other people who are equally entitled to it or equally qualified for it, then even though you are perhaps not depriving them of an employment opportunity, you're not hiring them, or you're not promoting them, but you are not giving them a training opportunity, for example, which we've seen in recent case law can be an adverse employment action that constitutes discrimination. So uh, it it's not an easy question.
No,
No.
it's not. But I think, my brain tends to think in
Yeah.
simple terms. And so if I were to put this in simple terms that I think work, right, the goal should be to open things up, removing barriers. The more barriers you remove, the more you open things up to different groups of people. That's all good stuff. The problem comes in is in restricting. So if you want to open things up for certain groups of people by restricting other groups of people, that's going to be a problem. But just keep removing barriers. And here's the reason why. Because if you don't remove barriers, you are in fact restricting. And so you don't want to be in a position where you're restricting any particular group. You want people, you want a whole crowd of qualified applicants trying to get through your door. That's what you want.
Exactly. So look, there's nothing wrong with posting your job postings at the historically black college or university in town. Just don't do that in place of posting at another one. Post everywhere and
Right.
get as many applicants as you can, because then whoever you end up hiring, you know that they will be the best person for the job.
Right.